We are. There's just a few more coming in.
We'll give it just another couple of seconds, just while I. Yeah. Oh, my hand's gone up already. Awesome. I reckon that's probably Steve. Just turned up. Hi, Steve. So, welcome to the Portfolio Prioritization and Resource Management webinar. This is the third webinar we've run, I think. We've done one on teams and projects, and one on project schedule and task management. And this time we're going to take a look through portfolio prioritization and also resource management. I've got a little panel of experts that joined me on the call. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Greg Carroll. I am delivery manager for Sensei here in Victoria. I've got 13 or 14 years experience in portfolio and project management, and the last 4 have been with Sensei. Prior to that, I was in PMO on most of the people on the call side of the fence, doing project and portfolio management. I just happen to have done over the course of my career in this stuff a whole heap of portfolio and prioritization, and it's sort of a specialist subject. Admittedly, it's a little bit dry, but it's a specialist subject of mine. I'd like to introduce John Price. Well, I'd like to let John Price introduce himself, actually. Go, JP.
Hi, folks. My name's John Price. I work with Greg in Sensei's Vic delivery team. I'm consultant, so I'm out and about delivering projects for customers, ranging from highly technical through to business focused. And I've been with the company for almost 4 years.
And Mark Soester.
Hi, my name is Mark Soester. I'm the Executive Director of Sensei Project Solutions. I've been with the company for a very long time, about 11 years, because I founded it initially, and my main responsibility and subject matter expertise is really in the strategic deployment of project portfolio management solution and embedding that capability into large organizations, not just technology, people, and processes as well.
So we did have a few pre-submitted questions, and I'm going to pick off the first of those first, actually, one of those first. And that's a great one, so thanks Sue from CS Energy. And that was, can you give us a demonstration of the prioritization tool, and maybe an example of a practical application, which is a perfect sort of segue into what I want to talk about today. Also, so there are a whole heap of people, I think we're 35 people plus. If you want to ask a question, feel free. You can either pop your hand up using the pop your hand up feature, and we'll cut across to you, or if you add something into the chat, I'll do the demo quick, and I'll have a quick look through the chat. So feel free to type something in, and feel free to interrupt, actually. So I'm happy for this to be not death by PowerPoint, and an opportunity for people to ask questions.
Greg, can I interrupt straight away?
Yes.
Just the chat function doesn't work for us. It says it only works for our team members.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
So,
I didn't know that.
That's actually a recent Microsoft Teams bug, unfortunately. The way that it can work is if you log out of the meeting and log back in again. Sometimes that can help, but if not, use the raise your hand and then you can ask the question verbally. But if someone is experiencing the fact that you can't see the chat channel, logging out of it and then trying to join again a lot of times works. If not, and you can still talk, raise your hand and then we can make sure that you get to ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it seems to be working for some people and not for others. So what do we mean by portfolio management? So when we talk about portfolio prioritization, here's a framework that we use in Sensei, and this shows a typical sort of project management life cycle down the bottom. And up the top here, we've got portfolio life cycle. And usually a portfolio life cycle happens in two discrete sort of functions. So one's that sort of analysis that you do when your projects are underway. And usually it's in the form of things like status reports and governance groups. And you track your portfolio projects, you make sure they're going okay, and if they're not, you adjust them. But before those projects make it into your portfolio of projects, it's usually some sort of method for building out that portfolio, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about portfolio management. It's how do we align the strategy of the business to the projects that we want to do, and then how do we go about deciding which of those projects to do. And it's not always super straightforward. So often, particularly in diverse portfolios, you'll be trying to compare two projects that do two very different things and deciding which has the most merit and which you should do and which you shouldn't. But we usually work in a constrained environment and we can't do all of the things that we want to do. We have to pick some, so we've got to pick the ones that give us the best bang for our buck. So I thought I'd talk through an area of the system that doesn't see a lot of action. I think there are a fair number of people that don't realise that they've got a strategy section in Project Online, and I'm hoping that most people here have got Project Online or have had some exposure to it. But there is built into the tool, so likely everyone's got a tool for doing just this, aligning projects to strategy and trying to determine their priority with a view to selecting the ones that are best for the business and dropping out the ones that are not. It's got a fairly standard process. I'll run through it really quickly, but I think it's reasonably simple, but I think pretty powerful in the way that it works. And the process is quite straightforward. We have drivers. We weight those drivers, we prioritize our projects, and that lets us do some analysis to try and work out which projects we should do. It's part of Project Online, doesn't require any extra licenses. It's just sat there, usually in the bottom left-hand corner, something called strategy if you've got access to it. It's got a built-in method and process. It's a little bit, honestly, it's not the sexiest area of the system. It looks a little bit tired, might be the right word, I think. But nonetheless, I think it's super powerful actually, and actually pretty easy to use, and you can get a prioritization out of it like reasonably quickly. I'm going to cut into it. I'm going to cut into the system. So this is relatively high risk in the live demo, but I'll show you all the various bits and how they hang together. So I'm in one of our demo environments. It's actually over in the US, so I'm not really allowed to touch it. Get pretty precious about their demo environment, but I'll run through this really quickly. So here we have on the left-hand side here, usually you've got this thing called driver library, and this is where you can define the business drivers that you want to use to assess your projects. So this one I've got, it's just a demo one, expand into new markets and segments. And you take that driver and develop some impact statements for it.
Just needs milk.
Those impact statements run from a low impact or no impact to an extreme impact. And ideally, what you want to do is try and put some numbers in here. So when you assess projects, it's best to, if you can, apply some numbers so that you can assess them.
Well, it needs to be a numerical value to prioritize against, and I think that is really the key. In order for us to prioritize those areas, we need to clearly communicate what those different areas of low, moderate, and strong actually means.
Yeah, but you don't have to. So this allows you to do prioritization on things that are a little bit fuzzier. If you need to do that, and often we do need to do that, but numbers are best if you can get them in there. Also stops people gaming the system, actually. once you've defined your drivers, and let me tell you, that's not necessarily the most straightforward process, because these drive the whole prioritization process. We want to compare them against each other, because not all drivers are created equal. So some drivers have got a more importance than other drivers, and it actually gives us a tool to do that. So I'm going to have a look in the IT director's driver prioritization. Oh, it's probably the worst one I can pick. And what that tool does, it allows us to compare each of the drivers against each other. So here we've got that expand into new markets and segments driver. And what we do is we compare it to all the other drivers in our collection of drivers. So this is improved customer satisfaction. And we make a relative decision about which we think is the most important. So expand into new markets and segments is extremely more important than improving customer satisfaction, or is extremely less important than customer satisfaction, or is somewhere in the middle. And we can run through each of those drivers and compare them to each of the other drivers. Doesn't take as long as you might think.
Yeah, and it's generally not something that you would do on a regular basis. This is usually something at the start of a strategy where you define the business drivers, and then through different roles, you will find that there are different priorities, of course, but ultimately they do need to agree to a consensus, right?
Mm. So, and it can be a little bit tricky. So usually you do this with, is that a question, JP?
I was just going to chime in and say the way for this to have any sort of validity in the business is if the prioritization is done at the highest level. So ideally you want to get the senior managers in the room, and likely this is going to take a couple of iterations to get them to agree, A, that the drivers are appropriate, and to agree the prioritization of those drivers against each other.
That's exactly right, spot on. Yeah.
So the way I've done this in the past, the way I've run this in the past actually is using something called, it was a tool called Poll Everywhere. And it's like a voting, sort of anonymous voting tool. And we'd put the drivers up, and then I'd ask the executive team to rate what they thought the relative importance was. And I took that, we actually put those up on the screen, and everyone could work out which they thought was the most important, and it drove that consensus, but it also allowed people to be a little bit anonymous. So we tried to avoid the sort of loudest voice in the room scenario. Once you've got your drivers prioritized, then what you need to do is to run through the projects that you have and assess each of those projects against these drivers. So we've got 4 drivers here. It's automated sensor system, and you go and pick how they relate to the drivers. And if those are numeric, usually you'd examine the business case, or to try and pull out the numbers so you get some quantifiable business benefit. Once you've done that, so we've got a selection of drivers. Those drivers have been weighted, so we know which are the most important. We've got the list of projects that we have on the list of things to do, and we assess each of those projects against those drivers. We can generate a priority list. So the system does some snazzy maths in the background. Uses something called eigenvectors. And it gives a relative priority. So this always adds up to 100%. And what this is saying is that the Olive Creek drone location sensor project is the highest priority and contributes just over 8% towards the strategic value of all of the projects that we've got in our portfolio. And the regulatory air quality sensor upgrade is the lowest priority of those projects. And so in the past, it's actually a relatively easy exercise to run through this prioritization process. You can do it. You can do it on your own. Actually, you can take a list of projects, if you've got a handful, even just for a small, like a PMO improvement project, and you can run through this process and see what it spits out and give yourself a prioritized list of projects. And I think it's relatively straightforward to do. And the value of having your projects prioritized and knowing which is your highest priority and which is your lowest is makes a whole heap of decision making in your business much easier. Not always going to be easy, but much easier if everyone's got a shared knowledge of which we think is the most important and which we think is the least. Even after we've picked them and the prioritization and the project's running, we can still notionally carry this prioritization forward. I've got a question come in from Steve. You can prioritize a subset of projects, can't you? Yes. So you can do a prioritization as often as you want. What it does is it sort of extracts the data and it packages it up in this analysis section here. And so you can do multiple analysis. You can do analysis with different sets of drivers. Often different groups of people will have different interpretations of priority and of those drivers. And you can pick little subsets of projects. Can we see it? Yeah, of course. I'll do a quick. So another question is, can we see how? So to do that, we do that back in this define the properties of the analysis that we want to do. So we create a new analysis. This one's the FY19 portfolio analysis. We decide which drivers we want to use in here, and then we select the projects that we want to include in this analysis. So at the moment they're all in there, but we could pick a different set of projects, add projects, take projects away, and push them across into this selected projects area. At this point, they will fall into here, and we can continue the analysis on them. So what's this? Oh, does it keep the prioritization history at all? So more questions. So yeah, does it contain? Yes, it does. Oh, you're on mute, Mark. Yeah, it does. So once you've done an analysis and you save it, it will just stay here. And the next analysis you do, you can add it on. So you can get a history of this analysis. Actually, and one of the benefits.
It's actually a what if scenario planning. So when you run through those analysis, you can have several different strategies. So you could run a scenario, let's call it a conservative scenario versus a gang-ho scenario versus a most likely scenario. So really the purpose of that is that you can run as many models as possible and then eventually decide which model is the most appropriate one. Once you've selected that, then the projects will be moved into that next stage. But really that feature is a classical what if scenario planning.
Yeah, and the other thing that happens is where you've got like some portfolios are really big. So there's actually, I think there's a limit of 700 projects or something here. I mean, prioritizing 700 projects is a job of work for anyone, I think. But what you can do is you can divide that up into areas or departments or however you want to divide up that portfolio and do the analysis on a subset of those and feed up into one broader portfolio. I've got heaps of questions coming in.
Yep. So Mike has asked, how would you manage having different business drivers across different sub-portfolios? For example, where you may have different product portfolios that may have different strategic objectives.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So what we do there is we're not limited to the numbers of drivers that we're not limited to the number of drivers that we can create. So we'd create different sets of drivers for different departments, and those could be prioritized independently. So we can use different sets of drivers in here. So we can have, I don't know, 50. And then we can prioritize those in the various departments. We can run scenarios by selecting those departments at projects. and have a prioritization by department. Absolutely. So it gets a little bit better. So this is my particular favorite. Once we've got this priority list, if we know how much a project's likely to cost, we're then able to do some slightly more advanced selection techniques. What we've got here, so I've used this proposal cost value for these projects, and what this is saying is if we want to do 100% of the strategic value, all of our projects, then the total cost of delivering that is just over 12 million bucks. If you've got all the money, do all the projects. Why not? Oftentimes we don't have all the money, and so what we can do is we can reduce the amount of cash that we have for a given analysis, and what the system will then do is it will work out how to deliver the most strategic value for the money that you've got. And in the background here, it actually does some pretty complicated maths. So it doesn't start with all right, we've got $5 million. We'll start with the highest priority project and work our way down till we've run out of money. What it does is it tries to get you the most strategic value that it can for the money that you've got. So some projects might not be the most expensive, but might deliver a more strategic value. And so what it will do is it will say, do we run, one large one, or 5 medium ones, or 15 small ones? And it, in the background, it does every single possible combination of projects you've got in your portfolio, calculates how much they are, how much money you've got, and then tries to give you the best bang for the buck. And that's represented here by this blue line, which is called the efficiency frontier. And that is the maximum amount of strategic value that you can deliver for any given value of projects. And so it tells you if you've got $5 million, actually, and you want to, you should deliver these projects. And you'll notice that in here are some relatively high priority projects or deliver high strategic value, but they're also relatively expensive. And doing that sort of maths actually is pretty tricky. And we can then, if we need to, and so in my experience, what this does when you do this portfolio prioritization process is it doesn't always do it right, but it gets you to a position quite quickly and relatively scientifically, so you can go, right, if you've got $5 million and you agreed these are the drivers and you agreed these are the most important ones, we've assessed the projects against them, you should do these projects. And what it does, it gets you to that conversation faster and with some data to back up your position, and then the bun fight starts. So then we start to apply that political lens, and we can say, actually, this one here is politically so important, or for a compliance reason is so important, or it's a strategic initiative, we have to do it. What you can do is you can then force that project in and say, well, it's not an option, we have to do that one, it's a strategic initiative, regardless of what the drivers say, it needs to be in. Sometimes it's a captain's call. We can recalculate that. It does the same thing again, tries to get you the best bang for the buck, including this project, which isn't the most efficient one to deliver, a whole bunch drop out. So it's saying, if you really want to do this one, then don't do this one, don't do this one, and you're not going to be able to do this one. And that gets slightly less efficient portfolio, and that starts to drop off the efficiency frontier. I can talk about this forever, so someone might need to stop me. if I start to get too boring.
Yeah, Greg, the only other point that you may want to make on this one, it's actually not only the cost limitation that you can do. You can actually prioritize your projects on a combination of different things. If you go onto the metrics, Greg, and go into modify, you will see that you have the ability to associate the prioritization based on your organizational specific values as well. Again, in order for us to capture them, they need to be numerical. In that instance, it's, for example, proposal cost and benefits, so that you have the ability to say, okay, well, actually, I mean, benefit is a bad one because you wouldn't want to lower your benefits, but you know, it could be it could be headcount, could be FTEs, it could be any kind of value that you find defines the ability for you to prioritize your project. In combination with the efficiency frontier from an executive perspective, you will actually then be able to have evidence really of why you select those what if scenarios, right? Because when I look at the strategic value here and the proposal cost, well, ideally I would want to have projects on the left-hand side up at the 100% mark and as low as possible. But what that efficiency frontier does is it really balances the equation between strategic value and in that instance cost. But it's not only cost. You can actually incorporate, well, any kind of numerical value which translates in project online as a project level custom field that is either a numerical value or a cost.
Awesome. I've seen a bunch of questions on the right-hand side, but I've been too busy talking. I haven't had enough. I haven't had my eyes on. I see JP, you've answered a fair few in the comment.
Yeah. But I do believe that the one from Simon Phillips. And my screen stops.
Yes, Simon, it is. The benefit column is a custom thing. Because we do need to manage benefits. Yeah.
I think I saw one in there about whether the proposal cost was an out-of-the-box field or not. I'm not sure. I think it might be in our demo environment, but I think any cost field you can use actually in there. So if you've got an enterprise custom field that's a cost custom field for projects, then you can use any of those, I think. That's
spot on. Mm. Yeah, so you actually set them up and it reads the project level custom fields. That's spot on.
Yeah. Mm. So you can, and also you can make these drivers, those drivers appear in project PDPs as well. So you can ask the project managers or the PMO as a project goes through its life cycle, fill in those drivers so that when you do the analysis, they're there already.
There's another one where I'm going to ask, can a project be in a non-created state, given this info can be very sensitive?
Sorry, I missed that.
Can the projects be in a non-created state, given this info can be very sensitive?
I've answered this question earlier on.
No. Well, you need to create a project in order to evaluate it. You have the ability to ensure that the evaluation of your project prioritization is based on the security, so that you would only be able to prioritize those projects that you are in charge of. But really, the idea is not so much from hiding them. The idea is to ensure that we have an objective capability determining which kind of initiatives do we want to go forward with, so that we accomplish our strategic goals or our business drivers. Hiding projects wouldn't accomplish that.
No. And I guess if they were super secret, you could always use a code name for it and, you know, limit the amount of details you put in there other than their strategic drivers and cost. If you didn't want some people in the organization to see them, that's one way of doing it. I've not come across that before. Usually it's the PMO that are doing it. Usually they have good oversight of that stuff.
Yeah.
I did have some other the pre-submitted questions, actually. Give me 2 seconds. We'll have a look at them, and then we'll cut across
While,
to...
while you do that, do you want to just quickly click onto the scatter chart, please?
Right.
Yeah, just for info, I know from an executive levels, a lot of numbers as in that table is often not what you are after. Very often you want to be able to say, hey, give me a big picture of all of the different initiatives and projects that I have. And through the visualization here, I can tell you, oh, look, this is a forced in project, and this is the one that I selected, and this is the one that I forced out. And these are the one that aren't selected. And when you when you mouse over them, you can actually see those. So from an executive view, quite often you will see those ones are actually the important visualizations behind it.
So this is strategic value. So effectively priority on this axis and cost on here. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's similar to the efficiency frontier. It just outlines every single initiative you've selected. So when you compare your efficiency frontier right now with the project value, then you know why the efficiency frontier has calculated what it has calculated. Yeah.
And the white ones are unselected.
Yeah.
So this is high value, but also really expensive. Like it's a decent size outlier. And has been unselected probably for that reason, probably because it's very expensive. Interesting.
Yeah, and again, this has one purpose only. It doesn't make the choices for you. It gives you a picture of objectivity that allows you to make the most appropriate decision. So it's not that, it really is just that component where we want to ensure that we have not only a consistent process, but a process that is visual, really. And you will find that these scenarios become super important, not so much after the first year or even the second year. It actually becomes really, really powerful once you have collected 2 or 3 years worth of data.
Actually, I've got a couple of pre-submitted questions. One, I think they're all really good, but I think one's about, can you prioritize ideas in a pre-project stage, so that haven't been that are in the ideas center or in Project Online that haven't been pushed into proper projects? And the answer to that is no, you can't. So that to do this, a project needs to be a project in Project Online for this strategy section for you to be able to pick it. But the idea of the ideas area isn't they're not there to be prioritized per se. They're there for, a better word, a sanity check, I suppose. So there's nothing to stop 3 people raising the same idea. Someone needs to go through that list and go, actually, it's a great idea, but we don't need 3 projects. We only need 1, and they select yes and push it forward into projects, and then that gets prioritized. But you need some mechanic to be able to allow people to submit ideas for projects, and then for you to be able to decide which goes through. And that's not necessarily prioritization at that point.
It's funneling, Greg. It's actually funneling.
Yeah. So you can't do it on ideas. You could, but you'd need to build this. I wouldn't recommend you tried. There's a bit of maths in this one, but yeah, you're better to funnel them and then push them into Project Online. They might go no further than being created, prioritized, and not move forward, but they do need to be in there if you're able to do that. Another question: how do you undertake a replanning exercise, COVID-19 related? That's why I'm doing a webinar from my house, isn't it? So look, the key to that, actually, you can do these prioritizations whenever you want. To be honest, the thing that would change potentially are the drivers. So the business drivers might change. Like, it's quite unusual circumstances. So the businesses are likely to be undergoing significant amounts of change, and so those business drivers are likely to need to change and or be reprioritized for sure, and also potentially the budgets. So it probably would be a perfect time to redo this exercise, actually, to reassess their priorities. This is a tool for doing that.
Yeah, we see that quite often in the financial services area, where they actually do these prioritizations at least on a quarterly basis. Most organizations tend to do that on an annual basis to determine their portfolio of projects.
And the final pre-submitted one, attractiveness and achievability. This is from Anne. Are often assessed to inform prioritization. Is this function available or planned? To be honest, for those achievability and attractiveness, you can actually use a driver. You can use a driver for that. I've certainly used doability in the past, whether it's something that we're likely to be able to achieve or not. Like, do we have people in house to be able to do this, or really go to market? I've used those as drivers before now. It's all very well having a mad list of projects to do, but if there's no chance you can do them, then you certainly need to take that into account, and I'd use the drivers for that actually. And I think I've done enough talking. I think it might be time for the resource management part of the piece. Checking for one last. No, what can you do a prioritization whenever you want? Yes, you can. So yeah, every time you do a prioritization, extracts the data and does the analysis. What you do with that analysis is up to you. So
that being said, the last thing that you may want to show there, Greg, if you go up onto the compare button, so let's assume you have gone through a couple of those scenarios, you actually have the ability to compare them. I don't know how many scenarios we have in this particular one, just give it 2 seconds. Oh yeah, so you can actually see in this instance, we have done an 8 million, a 9 million, a 9 million with compliance, a 10 million, a 5 million. So we've done these what if scenarios. That's why it's so important. You can run those anytime. It's not the point of having those scenarios. The point is that once we have selected a particular scenario that we've gone through, can you just close that again? Once you've selected that, you can then go into the scenario and select that scenario, and then there is a commit button. And what this particular commit button actually does is you need to go back to the tables. It doesn't do that. Oh yeah, it does it now. But don't do it. So what this commit button does now is it triggers on the workflow of all of these proposals and says either yes, you are approved, and therefore your phase is changing from select to planned, let's say. Or alternatively, if it's not selected, then it will stay in the system as something that you may want to do the following year. So really, what if scenario planning, as many as you like, as often as you like, the commitment of which path you would want to go to, that's the key. And that button here allows you then to literally get all of those projects that you selected from one phase or from one stage into another.
So I had a question, sorry, I'm going to one more. I had another, I could talk about this all day. I had a question about sensitivity, and so when I've run this, in my experience, it has a tendency to pick if you're not careful about how you structure the drivers, to pick a lot of smaller projects. Actually, it leans towards lots and lots of low value projects to deliver strategic benefit. I found occasionally that can be a problem, and I think it's more likely a problem with the setup and not getting the drivers right actually, and not assessing projects right. But that's if you're not careful, it does have a tendency to do that, and you need to manage that actually. All right, shall I stop talking now? I might hand over to oh, hang on, just one more. I have to keep saying one more. I can't see it. There's little icons over it. Can you redo prioritization?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question, Robin.
Without redoing
So the value of the project when it comes to the association of the strategic value or the business driver doesn't change only because you have, only because you haven't selected it in a particular scenario. I think key here is that the association of the project to all of the business drivers, that needs to be firm and truthful. Otherwise, if you change those, well, then the nature of the project in regards to accomplishment of strategic goals would, of course, change as well. However, of course, you do have the ability within the project to say, hey, actually, this is not an extreme, this is only a low, and you do have the ability to change that at any point in time. Absolutely. Right, definitely going to cut over to resource stuff now. Sorry, taking over a little bit. JP, if I'm okay to hand over to you, and you can talk a little bit about resourcing and maybe have a look at some of the pre-submitted questions. Well, I think you're on mute.
Certainly, I can just take control of this if you want, or I can share my screen. How would you want to?
If you've got the Prezzo up, I'd share yours, probably easiest.
Yep, not a problem.
And I'll try and answer the questions in the chat.
Yeah. Cool. I don't think I've shared the right thing.
Oh.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So limited time to get through this, but I'll try and get through it as quickly as possible. My name's John Price. I'm one of the consultants in the VIC team. Been with Sensei for approximately 4 years. Prior to that, I spent almost 9 years in operational roles in PMOs. My key focus was on resource management, timesheet implementation, schedule uplift for project managers and other staff working on projects, and working basically just to get the timesheet functionality really implemented and firing on all cylinders. And throughout that time, done a fair amount of implementations across a number of environments, and sort of came up with this roadmap approach to starting from scratch. So if an organization was quite low in resource management maturity and wanted to work out a way of getting from a sort of very limited base through to a well-oiled resource management machine, this is sort of the rough process that I worked through in order to do that. So my recommendation would be to start off doing no timesheets, get people really comfortable with managing projects, and then start working your way through what I call the granularity pyramid, and I'll come to that in a bit. So really working from high level, driven by the project manager, through to quite low level tasks, driven mostly by the team. And you can see that there's a switchover point here where you sort of go from tasks being independent of timesheets through to tasks and schedules and timesheets being quite highly coupled together. I don't really want to read through this ad nauseum. I'm very keen to get into the questions and start going through those. So we've got a couple of pre-submitted questions here. I'm going to start off with Edu's question. There's actually 4 parts to this question. The locate available resources to work on projects using resource assignment and resource availability, check staff capacity and engagement, resource utilization to show availability, and to provide an example of capacity and engagement's heat map. So there's quite a few things, and I'll start unpacking them sort of one by one. Locate available resources to work on a new project. So if you're using Project Online, that can be done quite simply, and I'll just fire up the environment where that is located. Just bear with me. I may have closed it down. Nope, I have it here. I'm just going to reshare my screen. So within Project Online, you have this thing called Resource Center, and this is very, very powerful, often underutilized part of Project Online. In this environment you're looking at here, we've got a list of all of resources who either are project managers, they could also be business analysts, testers, to pick IT specific roles. And the idea is really to build up that picture of all the resources who work in your organization. If you're wanting just to check availability of those resources, you can click on the capacity planning icon, and that'll give you a view of the selected resources. So you can see here we've got a few resources selected here, and then we can check their availability versus their capacity down here, and it will then show the aggregate of their assignments from the projects. So you can see here, for those selected resources, we do have a bit of spare capacity. So if a project came up and it did require Albert Connell to work, he's got some availability here in which we could assign him to some additional projects. I guess that sort of ties in with check staff capacity and engagement. These questions are quite interlinked, so you can sort of see all of this stuff all in one place. These things can be sliced and diced in a number of different ways. If you're more comfortable working in days, you can flick it to days. If you work around a weekly process, you can change it to by week, and that gives you a view of the capacity, and it will start slicing up the information in a slightly different way. And we can select as many or as few resources as we want using these views. And getting this stuff set up is not too tricky, but as mentioned before, there's definitely a recommended process for starting off down this path, and then sort of gradually working through to an increased level of granularity if required. And it might be that you hit a certain point where you're getting enough information that you don't need to go down to any lower level of granularity. Does that answer those questions there? I believe it does. I'm not sure if we have, in this particular environment, I'm not sure that we have all of the heat maps from our full product available, but we've certainly got several of those available through our Jumpstart and Empower products.
We have a question, JP.
There is, John, but that's a different. Yes, there is in that image. There is actually the heat map as well. However, this is the out-of-the-box capability, which is important. Yeah. The add-on of the heat map, so it's pretty super cool, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Question submitted?
Yes.
Cecilia?
One from Alice. Are assignment and engagement mutually exclusive? Question mark. I use one or the other.
That's a very good question.
So assignment is basically the actual deliverable task that you want someone to be working on, and typically that's done via the schedule. And once you make that available to someone, you can either update it as the project manager, which is sort of a PM controlled view of the world, or if you're working more enterprise, the end user who's assigned to the task could update it via My Activities, and that could be done via tasks or via timesheets. And there's a bit of consideration as to which path that you go down, and it really sort of depends on the organization's, I guess, willingness to do timesheets, if they see the value of doing timesheets. But it's worth noting that you can do all of this stuff without timesheets and get very, very similar results.
Yeah, I think that's super important, because in regards to resource management, it is actually the granularity of information that makes it complicated. I would always say that the engagement is generally a high-level project resource level request. Now, how you make up that number, there are different ways how you can do that, either through a schedule bottom up or just simply having a number. So they are actually technically dispersed. They do have one link together that says, hey, if you're an organization and you want to be able to request a resource, and you want to know whether the assignment of that resource maps the engagement, then you are okay. And if that assignment falls out or the engagement falls out of that time frame, then the schedule actually marks that to you and says, hey, be aware you've got a resource on that task that is assigned to your task, but you haven't got approval just yet. So that's how you can see the difference between engagements, meaning I want to request a top-down resource over a particular amount of time and need to have that approved, versus the time-based assignment of how long do I need that resource on the task.
Yeah, spot on. Couldn't have put it better myself. Moving on to some of the other questions, because I'm very, very cognizant of time here. Got a question from Cora. Well, it's actually a few questions again. How do we show that a resource is not available because they are already assigned in part to a project? So that this particular view that you're looking at here provides visibility of that, so you can see as work is assigned, it reduces the amount of availability for that particular resource, taking into account the projects that they're assigned to. The second question was, is on leave at a certain point in time? So this can be managed using MS Projects. So when you go into Resource Center, you can select resources here and you can edit them either in the browser or within Project Pro. If you edit them within Project Pro, you've then got access to their calendar. So if I select these resources here, I can open it in Project Pro, and then I can start to change the available working time of that particular resource. And each resource within Project Online has their own calendar. And within that calendar, I can specify if the person's part-time, if they're going to be on leave for a couple of weeks, say they're off on leave in July for 2 weeks. And once that information is saved, it flows back into Project Online. And when we're running those capacity planning charts, we can then see all that information flow back in. And if someone's on leave, they'll basically come up as having zero availability. And what MS Project will do at that point is it will reschedule the work to the next available time.
Yeah. Hey, John, can you just go back to that graph? Because in the context of capacity, it's actually a really good question. So there are different opinions about that. So some people say, hey, if I am on holiday, I just assign someone to another task called holiday so that I can see that. The issue that you face, though, is that capacity is not calculated correctly. Capacity is the total amount of time that you have to spend for all of the resources at hand. But if I'm a team lead of, let's say, 12 people, I will never have 12 FTEs because they are going on holiday. So my capacity is actually 10 FTEs. It is therefore hugely important that you actually manage non-working time in that calendar so that it reduces the overarching capacity. Otherwise, you know, if you calculate that over, let's say, 100 or 200 or 500 people, you will be completely out in regards to resource management otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. And that's really where the timesheet starts to come into its own, and you can start to capture things like people can submit their leave applications, you can capture support time and other what's referred to as non-working time. And it's always worth factoring in an allowance for this stuff, because it's very unlikely that anybody will work 100% on projects. If you attend so much as one internal team meeting per week, you're instantly not spending 100%. And based on sort of my experience in running this across a number of organizations, you typically tend to find that over the course of a year, a permanent employee will probably give you about 75% worth of project time when you take out leave and all the internal stuff that they end up doing.
Yeah, yeah. It's quite a lot, actually, if you don't manage capacity, really. It's 30% of resources, right? Mm-hmm. Mm.
I'm just working my way through some of the other questions here. Here's a great one from Julian. How would you recommend using Project Online to manage and report on sprint-based planning? So, obviously, Agile is becoming a highly popular delivery methodology, especially for delivering IT projects, but certainly aspects of that are being applied to other projects as well. Project Professional or Project Online, typically we're managing the entire schedule. I wouldn't really use it to manage things like this, like the tasks and the stories that need to be delivered through a sprint. But what I would use it for is to track all the resources that are required to work on that sprint and the amount of time that I need those resources to be on that sprint. Really, that's all I'm going to do for the agile component of a delivery of a particular project. To manage the actual individual stories and tasks, there's a number of different options. You could potentially use something like Microsoft Planner, which is essentially a bit of a Kanban board for managing those tasks, but there are numerous other tools that you could use. The reason why I like to use Planner is because you can create a link between the Planner board and your project schedule, so you've got a nice linkage between them.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. Resource management options where, this is a question from Richard Nyan, resource management options where timesheets are not used. So I don't like to kill people with the PowerPoint, but I actually think this is probably a good segue to look at this particular part of the PowerPoint that I've got here. This is my recommended approach for working from like a base level of having limited to no resource management all the way through to sort of quite fine-grained task management. And you'll see here that timesheets, whilst you can do top-level timesheets at step 2, you could essentially do this entire process without any timesheets whatsoever. And you're actually going to find that that's going to be quite a bit easier to implement. So the more you ask people to key into a timesheet, the more risk there is for picking the wrong task, for people not billing quite the right amount of time. This can certainly cause a few issues for project managers who are not necessarily used to managing their schedules in this way. Usually in non-enterprise environments, they'll have their project plan and they'll typically be calling up people to get a verbal or written update rather than it being rather than it being essentially pushed out to other users to provide an update via the tasks or timesheets functionality. And as we sort of do this stuff, as you sort of ask for more and more granularity, so as you sort of ask people to provide more and more detailed information in their schedule, you're going to find that the level of administration increases quite significantly. So that's definitely something to keep in the back of your mind. And there's definitely a change management impact to introducing timesheets. A lot of organisations, when you introduce the T word, there's often a riot on your hands and people can get quite concerned, might be a good way of putting it, that they're going to get beaten up and that they're going to get micromanaged with timesheets. And I actually like to focus on the alternative side of this, which is the reason why I like to use timesheets, is to actually build up a picture of what our true capacity is. How much time do we have to deliver for projects? And you often find that in organisations without timesheets, there's no data there to support any sort of meaningful planning, and often you find that there's 5 to 10 go-to people who all the work gets shoveled on until they break and go off on stress leave or they decide to quit. And that's quite a significant problem, and a lot of organisations definitely face this, and managing it is super important. So if you're going to go down the timesheet path, it's definitely worth articulating the benefit of timesheets to the end user as a mechanism to prevent them from being constantly overloaded with way too much work. And to put that in context, Medibank estimates the average cost of stress and burnout to the economy as being something in the region of $14.8 billion a year. So if that isn't a compelling case to sort out resource management for your projects, I don't know what is. Do we have any questions submitted via Teams? Because that's all the ones I can find in the submitted. If there's any other ones in Teams, I'm more than happy to answer those in the few minutes that we've got remaining.
Yep. Hi, JP. Timesheet versus task update. No difference, question mark, from Alice.
So yes, there is a difference. So tasks, you would only use those to get updates on project tasks, whereas timesheet starts to fold in the concept of leave and non-working time. So you can put in things like administration time, support time, meetings time, and these are things that don't get captured by tasks. Tasks is literally just designed to provide the end user the ability to update project tasks that are being assigned to them across the portfolio. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and just to add to that, JP, I think it's important that we also understand the purpose of the timesheet is not only for the end user to maintain the timesheet and the project manager. The timesheet functionality fulfills two options, or fulfills two goals. Number one, on one hand, I want to tell my team lead that I've worked 40 hours, and my team lead doesn't really mind whether I worked on 5 or 6 different projects, right? And on the other hand, I want to make sure that my project manager knows what kind of tasks I have been working on. So when you update your timesheet and you submit your timesheet, what actually happens is it goes, all of the tasks that you updated through the timesheet goes to the project task, and the project manager is able to accept them and updates them. And on the other hand, your team lead looks at your timesheet and says, "Oh, look, Mark worked for 40 hours." So we actually, hit 2 flies with 1 hit, really. So that's sort of the idea behind it.
Thanks, Mark. We're getting close to the end of the session here. There's just a couple of more, and I think they'll be the last ones that we can answer. So if you aren't using timesheets, you cannot account for non-working time?
You can still account for non-working time without timesheets. So again, that's using the calendar function inside resource sheets. So when you open up the resource into Project Professional, you can still define their non-working time, even if you're not using timesheets, and that will have a similar effect of rescheduling any work that was planned to occur during the leave period, or just reducing their available amount of capacity. So if you set the person's max units, for example, to 80%, it'll obviously reflect that back into any work that's assigned to that user, and if the sum of work exceeds their capacity, it will flag it up as an over allocation.
Thank you. And the last one is from Steve Harper. Resource allocation ties in with portfolio analysis to check there is capacity to deliver the selected portfolio, doesn't it?
We didn't show that module, but yes, absolutely. There is actually a second step in that prioritization process where you have the ability to say, hey, all of the projects that I selected now, do I actually have enough capacity for that? In order for that to work, though, you need to be a really, really, really super duper company, very diligent about it. Resource management at the best of times are difficult because it changes all the time. Mark gets sick tomorrow, Greg needs to assign someone else, that has another impact. So if you think about it that way, you absolutely can, and technically you can do that. But after now having done this for 125,000 years, I have never seen an organization who has actually mastered portfolio analysis based on the analysis of the portfolios and the schedule rigor that is required in order to incorporate that into the analysis. Yeah. Yes, the idea, great. Technically, great. Process and rigor, that's key. It's project, or actually in your instance, then portfolio management maturity.
And that's absolutely right. And that's often why I've always started off with very, very high level of granularity first, essentially quite big tasks to keep it very, very simple for the project managers to get used to the process of updating schedules on a regular basis. Yep. And then once that capability is embedded, will I then look to increase the level of granularity down to, say, the phase level or down to deliverable tasks. Starting at the bottom of the pyramid straight away is going to result in implementation failure.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%. And it's interesting because a lot of organizations says, oh, but you know what, my project managers, they're not very good in scheduling. It's not the question. The problem is that they don't know what kind of granularity you have. If you have a schedule with 10,000 tasks, then you need to prepare yourself to manage those 10,000 tasks. Hence the reason why JP quite rightly suggests that you should keep your tasks in the schedule to a maintainable stage.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks, Mark. Depends if we can squeeze in one last question that's coming from Sheridan. Could you use generic resourcing for planning in Portfolio Analyzer?
Definitely, you have to. It doesn't matter.
Recommend it.
Yeah, exactly. We recommend that actually. Yeah, because let's not forget that the project proposals that you select Well, quite often they don't really have named resources associated to them because they don't know that. I just know that I need a project manager or a business analyst, and that actually calculates the capacity of the project. Once you then select the project, you then have the ability to replace the generic resource with a named resource.
And also, if your project's not been approved, it would be a highly risky endeavour to assign a named resource, because it's highly unlikely that you will get that person if your project doesn't get any legs to go anywhere.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
All right, thanks. I think that's the end of the questions that have come through. Just also letting the people know that is still left, that we will make this recording available after, so we'll send it out to all of you. We'll also send out an evaluation form as well. So yeah, thank you all for joining and all the awesome questions.
And it would be awesome. It would be awesome if you could also maybe recommend some topics that are challenging for you right now that you would like to know more about.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Awesome.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Co-work session. Yay. Thanks, thanks, Greg. Cool.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks again, guys. See ya.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Bye.